Amos Thatcher woke to a sound that did not belong. His 82-year-old eyes struggled against the early dawn light, filtering through the gaps in his cabin walls. But what he saw through the window made his breath catch in his throat. Men, hundreds of them, maybe more, standing in perfect silence around his property, stretching as far as his failing vision could see. Apache warriors, every single one of them. They held no weapons raised, made no threatening gestures, yet their presence was absolute. They simply stood there watching his cabin as if waiting for something. Amos pressed his trembling hand against the rough wooden wall to steady himself. His mind raced backward, through the night, searching for answers that made no sense. How did they find him? What do they want? And why were they not attacking? 12 hours earlier, the storm had been merciless. Zan hammered the plains with a fury that turned the ground into mud and the sky into an endless void of darkness. Amos had been preparing to close the shutters when he heard it. A sound too weak to be the wind, too desperate to be an animal. He grabbed his lantern with shaking hands and stepped into the storm, his old bones protesting every movement. The cold bit through his worn coat, but something drove him forward, past the fence line, toward the ridge where the sound had come from. That was when he saw the boy. The child lay face down in the mud, barely moving, his clothing torn and soaked with rain and something darker. Blood. Amos dropped to his knees, his joints screaming in protest, and carefully turned the boy over. The face that stared back at him was young, no more than 12, with features that told Amos immediately what he was dealing with. Apache. The boy's chest rose and fell in shallow, desperate gasps. A deep wound ran across his side, and his leg bent at an angle that made Amos wheeze. Every instinct screamed at him to leave the boy there, to walk away and pretend he had seen nothing. The tensions between settlers and the tribes had grown worse with each passing season. Helping this boy could mean death. But as Amos looked into those half-closed eyes, he saw something that pierced through all his fear. A child dying, alone in the storm. He made his choice, slipping his arms beneath the boy's small frame. Amos lifted him as gently as his old body allowed. The boy weighed almost nothing, yet the walk back to the cabin felt endless. Each step sank into the mud. Each gust of wind threatened to knock them both down. By the time Amos pushed through his cabin door, his lungs burned and his vision swam with exhaustion. He laid the boy on his bed, the only bed in the cabin, and immediately began tearing away the soaked clothing to examine the wounds. His hands, which had once stitched soldiers back together during a war he tried hard to forget, now trembled as they worked, but muscle memory took over. He cleaned the wounds with water he boiled over the fire, pressed cloth against the bleeding, and carefully set the broken leg using strips of wood and torn sheets. The boy never woke. His breathing remained shallow, his skin pale beneath the dirt and blood. Amos worked through the night, checking the bandages, wiping the fever sweat from the boy's forehead, adding wood to the fire to keep the cabin warm. Outside, the storm raged on, and inside, an old man fought to save a life he knew could cost him his own. As the first hints of dawn began to break, Amos finally allowed himself to sink into the chair beside the bed, his body act in ways he had forgotten were possible. The boy's chest still rose and fell, weak but steady. Amos closed his eyes for just a moment, exhaustion pulling him under. That was when he heard it. The sound of footsteps, not one or two, hundreds, moving in perfect unison surrounding his cabin. And when Amos opened his eyes and looked through the window, he saw them. The warriors, an entire nation standing at his gate. But they were not there to attack. They were there to wait. And Amos had no idea why. Amos stayed frozen at the window, his breath coming in shallow bursts. The warriors remained motionless, their eyes fixed on his cabin. He counted at least 50 in his immediate view, but the formation extended far beyond what he could see. They wore traditional clothing, paint marking their faces in patterns he did not recognize. Some held spears, others bows, but none raised them in threat. They simply watched, waiting. His first instinct was to bar the door, to push his table against it and hide. But the thought died as quickly as it came. What good would a wooden door do against 1,000 men? If they want him dead, he would already be dead. He turned away from the window and moved back to the bed where the boy lay. The child's breathing had steadied slightly during the night, though his skin still felt too warm beneath Amos' palm. The bandages on his side showed only a small amount of fresh blood seeping through. A good sign. The leg remained immobilized in its makeshift splint. Amos pulled the blanket higher over the boy's chest and noticed something he had missed in the chaos of the night. Around the child's neck hung a leather cord with a small carved bone pendant. The craftsmanship was intricate, showing symbols Amos could not interpret. He lifted it gently, studying the markings in the morning light. Whatever this object was, it had been made with great care. He let it fall back against the boy's chest and stepped away. A sound outside made him turn. One of the warriors had moved closer to the cabin, just a few steps, but enough to break the perfect stillness. The man was older than the others, his face lined with age and experience. He carried himself differently, with an authority that needed no announcement. Amos' pulse quickened. This was not a random scout. This was someone important. The older warrior stopped 10 paces from the door and spoke in a language Amos did not understand. The words were firm but not angry, carrying a weight that transcended the barrier between them. Amos opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. What could he say? He knew no Apache words, had no way to explain what had happened. Instead, he moved slowly toward the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. Every instinct told him not to open it, but something stronger pushed him forward. He pulled the door open just wide enough to stand in the frame. The older warrior's eyes locked onto his, and for a long moment, neither man moved. Then, the warrior's gaze shifted past Amos toward the interior of the cabin, toward the bed. Recognition flashed across his weathered face. Not surprise, but confirmation. He had known the boy was here. They had all known. Amos felt the weight of that realization settle over him like a stone. They had not come searching. They had come knowing exactly what they would find. The warrior spoke again, this time his voice softer, almost reverent. He placed his right hand over his heart and bowed his head slightly. Then he turned and walked back to his position among the others. Amos stood in the doorway, completely lost. The gesture had seemed like respect, but respect for what? For saving the boy, for not running. Behind him, he heard a faint sound, a weak cough. He spun around and saw the boy's eyes flutter open for the first time. Dark eyes that looked directly at him with an intensity that made Amos' breath catch. The boy tried to speak, his lips forming words too quiet to hear. Amos rushed back to the bedside and leaned close. The boy whispered something in his own language. Then his eyes drifted closed again, pulling him back under. But in that brief moment of consciousness, Amos had seen something in the child's expression that changed everything. Not fear, not confusion, recognition. As if the boy had known Amos would be there. Amos stared at the unconscious boy, his mind racing. That look of recognition had been unmistakable. Had the child seen him before? It seemed impossible. Amos rarely left his property, and when he did, he avoided settlements where tensions ran high. He certainly had never ventured anywhere near Apache territory. Yet the boy had looked at him as if Amos was expected, as if his presence beside that bed was somehow meant to be. The sound of movement outside pulled him back to the present. Through the window, he saw the warriors shifting formation, not scattering or advancing, but parting down the center to create a clear path. Another figure emerged from beyond the ridge, walking slowly toward the cabin. This man was even older than the warrior who had approached earlier, his long gray hair hanging loose over his shoulders. He wore a ceremonial robe decorated with intricate beadwork, and he moved with the careful dignity of someone whose body had earned every ache. Two younger warriors flanked him, but they stopped when he continued forward alone. Amos felt his throat tighten. Whoever this man was, his importance was beyond question. The old man stopped at the same spot where the previous warrior had stood and looked directly at Amos through the open door. His face was deeply lined, his eyes holding depths of experience that made Amos feel young despite his own 82 years. The man raised one hand slowly, palm forward, in what Amos recognized as a gesture of peace. Then he spoke, and though the language remained foreign, the tone carried unmistakable emotion. Not anger, not threat, grief mixed with something else. Hope perhaps, or gratitude. Amos took a step forward, then hesitated. How could he possibly communicate? He gestured helplessly toward the cabin interior, toward the bed where the boy lay. The old man's eyes followed the gesture, and his expression softened. He spoke again, this time his voice breaking slightly. A single word repeated. Amos did not understand it, but he heard the weight it carried. The old man touched his chest, then extended his hand toward the cabin. His meaning clear, even without shared words. The boy was his family, his blood. Understanding crashed over Amos like a cold wave. This was not just any child. This boy meant everything to this man, and by extension, to every warrior standing. Silent watch around the property. Amos had not simply saved a wounded child. He had saved someone precious beyond measure. He wanted to say something to explain that he had only done what any decent person would do, but his voice failed him. Instead, he simply nodded, acknowledging the unspoken connection between them. The old man's eyes glistened, and he placed both hands over his heart before turning away. But he did not leave. None of them left. They resumed their positions, their vigil unbroken. Amos retreated into the cabin and closed the door, leaning against it. As his legs threatened to give out, the weight of what he had stepped into pressed down on him. These men would not leave until something changed, until the boy woke fully, perhaps, or until he died. Amos moved back to the bed and checked the boy's bandages once more. The bleeding had stopped completely. The fever seemed less intense. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. He dampened a cloth and wiped the child's face, clearing away the dried mud and blood. As he worked, he noticed more details. A scar on the boy's shoulder, calluses on his small hands that spoke of hard work, a bearing that suggested strength even in unconsciousness. Hours passed in tense silence. Amos tried to eat, but found he had no appetite. He kept water boiling on the fire, changed the bandages twice, and monitored the boy's breathing. Outside, the warriors remained. No sound came from them. No movement except for the subtle shifts of men maintaining position over a long watch. As afternoon shadows began to stretch across the cabin floor, the boy stirred again. This time his eyes opened wider, and he turned his head toward Amos. His lips moved, forming words in his own language. Then in broken but clear English, he whispered a single sentence that made Amos' heart stop. He said you would come. Amos stared at the boy, his mind struggling to process those words. He said you would come. The sentence hung in the air between them. Impossible, yet spoken with complete certainty. The boy's dark eyes remained fixed on him, waiting for a response Amos did not know how to give. Who said? Amos finally managed, his voice rough with confusion. Who told you I would come? The boy's lips moved slowly, forming words that clearly caused him pain. My grandfather. When they chased me, he told me to run north to find the cabin with smoke always rising. To find the old man who lives alone. He paused, breathing hard. He said, if I could reach you, I would be safe. Amos felt the room tilt. The boy had not stumbled upon his property by accident. He had been running toward it, seeking it, deliberately. But how had the grandfather known about Amos? How had he known where to send the boy? Amos lived miles from any settlement, deliberately isolated. He had spoken to perhaps 3 people in the past year. Why? Amos asked, leaning closer. Why did he tell you to find me? The boy's eyes drifted toward the ceiling, his strength clearly fading. 2 seasons ago, you helped a man near the trading post. White men were beating him. You stopped them. He coughed, and Amos quickly lifted a cup of water to his lips. After drinking, the boy continued, "That man was my uncle. He came home and told my grandfather about the old settler who stood between him and death when he did not have to, who risked himself for someone he did not know." Memory struck Amos like lightning. He did remember a younger Apache man being kicked by 3 settlers outside a trading post. Amos had intervened, using his age and presumed harmlessness to defuse the situation. He had told the settlers he knew the man, that there had been a misunderstanding. The lie had worked. The Apache man had left unharmed. Amos had thought nothing more of it, just an old man doing what felt right. "My grandfather never forgot," the boy whispered. "He said you were the only white man he would trust, that if danger came, I should find you." His eyes closed briefly, then opened again. "They came yesterday, white men from the settlement. They accused me of stealing their horses. I did not, but they did not care about truth. They wanted to hang me as a warning." Amos felt rage kindle in his chest, hot and fierce despite his age. A child? They had been hunting a child. "How did you escape?" "I ran. They followed on horses. I hid in the rocks, but one found me. He had a blade. I fought." The boy gestured weakly toward his wounded side. "I got away, but I was hurt. I knew I could not make it to my people, so I came here. Like my grandfather said, the pieces fell into place. The grandfather had given his grandson a lifeline, a single place to run when nowhere else was safe. And the boy had made it barely through a storm and miles of dangerous terrain." Amos looked toward the door, understanding finally why 1,000 warriors stood outside. They were not just protecting the boy. They were honoring the man who had kept the promise their leader had trusted. "Your grandfather," Amos said carefully. "The old man who came this morning, that was him." The boy nodded. "He is chief of our people. Why did not return last night? He knew where I would have gone. He brought everyone to protect us both because the men who hurt me might come here." He tried to sit up but fell back with a gasp of pain. "You are in danger because of me." Amos placed a weathered hand on the boy's shoulder. "I was in danger the moment I decided to be a decent human being. I have never regretted those choices, and I will not start now." He adjusted the blanket and checked the bandages. "What is your name?" "Boy." "Niati." The boy answered. "It means he who wrestles." "Well, Niati, you wrestled your way through a storm and a hunting party to get here. That took more courage than most men show in a lifetime." Amos managed a small smile. "Rest now. You are safe." But even as he spoke those words, Amos heard something that made his blood freeze. Horses. Multiple horses approaching from the south, and voices. Angry voices shouting. In English. The settlers. They had tracked the boy here, and they were coming with violence in their hearts. Amos moved to the window, with speed his body should not have possessed. 6 riders emerged from the tree in there, horses kicking up dirt as they approached. Even from a distance, he could see they carried rifles. The lead rider was a thick man with a red face, his expression twisted with anger. Behind him rode 5 others, all armed, all focused on the cabin. The Apache warriors shifted instantly. Would have been a peaceful vigil transformed into something else entirely. The formation tightened. Weapons that had hung loose now held ready. Yet they did not advance. They simply stood between the approaching riders and the cabin, an unmovable wall of flesh and determination. The grandfather stepped forward from among them, positioning himself at the very front. The riders stopped 50 feet from the warrior line. The lead man, the one with the red face, shouted across the distance, "We know. That Apache thief is in there. Send him out and nobody gets hurt." Amos felt his hands ball into fists, his heart hammered against his ribs. Behind him, Niati tried to sit up. "Do not let them take me," the boy whispered, fear finally cracking through his brave exterior. "Please stay down," Amos commanded, surprised by the firmness in his own voice. He looked back at the boy. "I did not save your life to hand you over to men who want to end it." The red-faced man shouted again. "Old man, we Saw the blood trail leading here. That savage killed one of our horses and tried to steal two more. We got a right to justice. Lies. Amos recognized lies when he heard them. These were men who had decided on a story and would not be swayed by truth. He had seen their kind before, during the war, during the years. After, men who used justice as an excuse for cruelty. His hand shook as he moved toward the door, but this time not from age or fear, from rage at men who would hunt a child. He pushed the door open and stepped outside, placing himself between the warriors and the riders. The sudden appearance of an elderly white man seemed to confuse the settlers. The red-faced one squinted. "Thatcher, that. You?" "It is," Amos replied, his voice carrying across the space. "And you are?" "On my property, Garrett." With weapons drawn and threats being made, Garrett shifted in his saddle momentarily. "Throne, this ain't about you, old man. That Apache boy killed valuable property. We tracked him here. Law says we can bring him in. Law says you need evidence." Amos shot back. "Law says you need a trial. Law says you do not get to hunt children like animals and call it justice. He is a thief and a killer." One of the other riders yelled. "He is a boy who is defending himself from men who wanted to hang him." Amos countered. "I know what he is accused of, and I know it is false. He came to me for help, and I am giving it. You want him? You will have to go through me." The words shocked even Amos as they left his mouth. An 82-year-old man standing against 6 armed riders. It was foolish. It was suicidal. It was the only thing he could do and still call himself a man. Garrett's face darkened. "You are protecting a savage. After everything our people have suffered, I am protecting an innocent child from murderers." Amos replied, "There is a difference." The tension stretched like a wire about to snap. Garrett reached for his rifle, and immediately every Apache warrior raised their weapons in response. The grandfather did not move, did not speak, but his presence alone communicated absolute resolve. If the settlers started violence, none of them would leave this place alive, and they knew it. Garrett looked at the wall of warriors, then back at Amos. His jaw worked, chewing over his options. Finally, he spat on the ground. "This is not over, Thatcher. That boy is a criminal. You're just delaying the inevitable." "The inevitable," Amos said quietly, "is that you will leave my property now, or you will face consequences you cannot imagine." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Garrett jerked his reins, turning his horse. "Let us go," he growled to his men. "But we will be back with more men, and we will get that Apache one way or another." The riders retreated, their threats hanging in the air like smoke. Amos watched them disappear beyond the ridge, his legs suddenly weak. He had just made enemies of men who would not forget, men who would return with reinforcements and a desire for revenge. He turned slowly and found himself face to face with the grandfather. The old chief studied him for a long moment, then placed a hand on Amos' shoulder. No words were needed. The gesture said everything. Respect, gratitude, brotherhood. Then the chief looked past Amos toward the cabin, toward his grandson, lying wounded inside. And in that shared glance, Amos understood the warriors were not leaving. Not until Niadi could safely travel home. And if the settlers returned, there would be a war. 3 days passed. 3 days during which the warriors maintained their vigil without complaint or movement beyond necessary shifts. They brought no tents, built no fires that Amos could see from his window. They simply stood watch, an unbreakable circle of protection around the cabin and the boy who lay inside it. Nayati improved with each sunrise. The fever broke on the second morning, and by the third day, he could sit upright without his face going pale. Amos changed his bandages twice daily, pleased to see the wounds closing cleanly without infection. The boy's leg would take longer, but the swelling had reduced significantly. In another week, perhaps 2, he would be able to walk. With support, they spoke little at first. Amos focused on the practical tasks of healing, and Nye, it seemed, content to rest and observe. But gradually, as strength returned, words came easier. The boy told stories of his people, of learning to track animals with his uncle, of the games he played with other children. Amos found himself sharing memories too, fragments of a life he rarely discussed. His days as a field surgeon during the war, his wife dead, now 15 years, the son he had lost to fever decades ago. You have been alone a long time, Nayati observed one afternoon, his young voice carrying unexpected wisdom. I have, Amos admitted, stirring a pot of stew over the fire. After my family passed, there seemed little reason to seek out company. People bring complications. But you helped my uncle anyway and me. Amos paused, considering helping someone in danger is not the same as seeking companionship. It is simply doing what is right. My grandfather says the same thing. Nayati shifted on the bed, wincing slightly. He says, character is what you do when no one is watching. When there is no reward, the old chief visited twice each day. He would approach the cabin, and Amos would open the door to allow a brief exchange. The language barrier remained, but communication happened through gestures, through the universal language of a grandfather checking on his wounded grandson. Each time, the chief would place his hand over his heart and bow his head slightly to Amos before returning to his people. On the fourth day, one of the younger warriors approached with an offering. Fresh meat, still warm, wrapped in cloth. Amos accepted it with gratitude, understanding the gesture for what it was. They were providing for him as he provided for Nayati. A fair exchange. He cooked the meat that evening, sharing it with the boy, and for the first time in longer than he could remember. The cabin did not feel quite so empty, but the peace was fragile. Amos knew it. Every time he looked south toward the settlement, he wondered when Garrett would return. The man had made a promise, and men like Garrett kept such promises. They would come back. They would bring more riders, perhaps even involve whatever passed for law in this territory. And when they did, blood would spill. On the fifth morning, as Amos helped Nayati take his first careful steps across the cabin floor, the boy asked the question that had been hanging between them. When they come back, what will you do? Amos guided him back to the bed, his mind already working through scenarios he had been avoiding. I do not. No, he admitted. Your grandfather and his warriors will fight if they must. Good men will die on both sides. All because men like Garrett cannot let go of hate. It is not fair, Nayati said quietly. You did nothing wrong. You should not suffer for helping me. Fairness has little to do with how the world works. Amos sat heavily in his chair, feeling every one of his 82 years. But that does not mean we stop trying to do what is right, even when it costs us. That evening, as the sun began to set, Amos stood outside the cabin. The chief approached without summons, as if sensing that Amos needed to speak. They stood together in silence for a long moment, two old men who had lived too long and seen too much. Finally, Amos spoke, not knowing if the words would be understood, but needing to say them anyway. When they come, I want you to take Nayati and leave. Get him home, safely. Let me deal with the settlers. The chief's eyes narrowed. He understood enough. He shook his head firmly, gesturing to the warriors, then to Amos, then to the cabin. His meaning was clear. They would not abandon him. Amos nodded slowly, accepting what could not be changed. When the settlers returned, everyone here would face the consequences together. He looked at the horizon where the last light was fading. Tomorrow, he thought, or the day after. But soon, very soon, everything would come to a breaking point. They came on. The sixth day. Not 6 riders this time, but 20 armed men from the settlement. Some Amos recognized, others he had never seen. They brought rifles, revolvers, and the absolute certainty that numbers gave them power. Garrett rode at their front, his red face even more flushed with anger and purpose. Behind them, 3 men carried a makeshift banner bearing official markings. They were claiming legal authority now, pretending this mob had the backing of law. The Apache warriors responded immediately. Their formation shifted from observation to defense. Weapons ready, faces grim with the knowledge of what was coming. The chief moved to the front line again, but this time he was not alone. Warriors flanked him on both sides, creating an impenetrable wall between the settlers and the cabin. Amos counted quickly. The settlers had numbers, but they were farmers and merchants playing at being soldiers. The warriors were trained from childhood for exactly this kind of confrontation. Amos stepped outside before anyone could fire the first shot. His heart hammered, but his steps were steady. He positioned himself between both groups. An old man in worn clothing standing in the space where violence waited to be born. Garrett pulled his horse to a stop and stared down at him with contempt. "Last chance, Thatcher," Garrett called out. "We have jurisdiction now. That boy is wanted for theft and destruction of property. Hand him over, or we will take him by force, and anyone protecting him becomes an enemy of lawful authority." "Lawful authority?" Amos replied, his voice carrying across the tense silence. "You mean the paper you had someone sign in town? That is not law. That is an excuse to commit murder." "He killed a horse." One of the other riders shouted. "Show me the proof," Amos demanded. "Show me one witness who actually saw him do it. Show me anything beyond your word and your hate." Garrett's face darkened further. "We do not need to prove anything to you. Old man, we have the authority, and we are taking that Apache boy. Now, step aside, or we will move you aside." "You will have to kill me first," Amos said simply. "And then you will have to kill every warrior standing behind me." "Is one boy worth that many lives, Garrett? Is your pride worth starting a war?" For a moment, uncertainty flickered across several faces in the settler group. These were not hardened killers. They were men who had been whipped into anger by Garrett's rhetoric, men who had convinced themselves they were doing something righteous. But faced with the reality of mass bloodshed, some were reconsidering. Garrett sensed it too. He raised his voice, addressing his men rather than Amos. "We let this go, and they will think they can do whatever they want. Steal from us, attack us, and hide behind threats. We show weakness now, and we will regret it. I show you something," a voice called out in accented English. Everyone turned to see the chief stepping forward, gesturing for Amos to move aside. Amos hesitated, then did so. The old chief reached into his robe and pulled out a leather pouch. He opened it and withdrew several small objects, holding them up for all to see. Coins. White man's coins, more than most of the settlers would see in a month. The chief pointed at Garrett, then at the ground, then at his own chest. His meaning was clear, even without perfect language. He was offering payment, compensation for whatever the settlers claimed had been lost. It was a peace offering, an attempt to end this standoff without bloodshed. Garrett stared at the coins, and for a heartbeat, Amos thought reason might prevail. Then Garrett spat. "We do not want your money, savage. We want justice. Our justice." He raised his rifle. Time seemed to slow. Amos saw the barrel coming up, saw fingers tightening on triggers throughout both groups, saw the moment about to explode into violence that would leave dozens dead. Without thinking, without planning, Amos threw himself forward. Not at Garrett, at the chief. He grabbed the old man's arm and pulled him backward, his body placing itself between the Apache leader and the pointed weapons. "Stop!" Amos roared with a force that shocked even himself. "Enough, all of you." He turned to face the settlers, his body still shielding the chief. "You want to start this killing? You start with me, an old white man who fought for this country, who lost everything to give you the peace you enjoy. You shoot me down in cold blood while I stand unarmed, and you explain to everyone in that settlement how that was justice." The riders shifted uncomfortably. Garrett's rifle wavered, but did not lower. "Move, Thatcher. This is your last warning." "No," Amos said quietly. "This is yours. You fire that weapon, and history will remember you as the man who murdered an 82-year-old man trying to prevent a massacre. Your children will bear that shame. Your name will be cursed. Is it the legacy you want?" The silence that followed was absolute. Every eye was on Garrett, waiting to see what he would choose. Pride or reason, violence or retreat. The rifle shook slightly in his hands, and Amos saw the war happening behind the man's eyes. Finally, with a sound of pure frustration, Garrett lowered the weapon. "This is not over," he said, his voice thick with barely contained rage. Not by a long shot, but he turned his horse, and one by one the other settlers followed. 2 weeks passed before Nayati could walk without assistance. 2 weeks during which the warriors remained, their presence a constant reminder that some bonds transcend language and culture. The settlers did not return. Word had spread through the territory about what happened, about an old man who stood between armies and refused to move. Garrett's reputation had suffered. Men questioned his judgment. The appetite for violence had diminished, replaced by uncomfortable questions about who the real criminals were. On a clear morning, the chief came to the cabin with purpose in his step. He spoke to Nayati in their language, and the boy translated for Amos. "My grandfather says, I am strong enough to travel home. He thanks you for giving him back his grandson. He says you have given him something he thought he had lost." Amos felt a tightness in his chest. He had known this moment would come, yet it arrived with an unexpected weight. Tell him it was an honor to help, that his grandson is brave and good, and any grandfather would be proud. As Nayati translated, the chief's weathered face softened. He reached into his robe and withdrew something, pressing into Amos' palm. A small carved pendant similar to the one Nayat wore, but older, more worn. The chief spoke, and Nayati translated carefully. "This belonged to my great-grandfather. It marks you as family, as brother. Any of our people who see this will know you are under our protection always." Amos stared at the pendant, understanding the magnitude of what had just been given. Not just a trinket, but acceptance into a family, into a people. His throat tightened with emotion he had not felt in years. "I do not know what to say." "You do not need words," Nayati said softly. "You already said everything when you chose to help a wounded boy in a storm." The warriors began their departure at midday. They moved with the same discipline they had maintained throughout their vigil, forming ranks and preparing for the journey home. Nayati, though still limping slightly, stood tall beside his grandfather. Before leaving, the boy approached Amos one final time. "Will I see you again?" Amos managed a smile. "The world is smaller than we think. Perhaps our paths will cross." "I hope so." Nayati embraced him, something that would have been unthinkable weeks ago. "You saved my life. I will never forget." As the Apache departed, Amos stood watching until they disappeared beyond the ridge. The silence that followed felt different than the loneliness he had known before. His cabin stood unchanged. His daily routine would resume, but something fundamental had shifted. He was no longer simply an old man waiting for death in isolation. He was someone who mattered, someone who had made a choice. That changed lives. That evening, a knock came at his door. Amos opened it to find a young settler woman, someone he vaguely recognized from town. She held a basket covered with cloth. "Mr. Thatcher, my husband and I heard what you did, standing up to Garrett like that. We wanted you to know that not everyone agreed with him. We brought you some food, and if you ever need anything, our door is open." More visitors came in the following days. Families who had been too afraid to speak against Garrett now found their courage. Some brought supplies, others simply wanted to thank him. A few asked his advice on disputes. Recognizing wisdom in a man who had prevented a war, Amos found himself part of a community he had spent years avoiding. The isolation he had chosen was replaced by connection he had not sought but could not deny. 3 months later, a young Apache warrior appeared at Amos' gate. He carried a message from a chief. Nayati had fully healed. He was training with the other young men, learning the skills of his people, and he spoke often of the old man who had saved him, ensuring that the story would be passed down through generations. The warrior also brought gifts, furs, dried meat, tools crafted with care from the people. He said in halting English, "Because you are family." Now, Amos accepted the gifts with gratitude, understanding that this was not charity, but reciprocity. He gave aid when it was needed most, and now his new family ensured he would never want for anything. As the warrior departed, Amos looked around his property with new eyes. The cabin that had been a prison of grief had become a bridge between two worlds. His choice to show compassion to one wounded boy had rippled outward, touching more lives than he could count. He was 82 years old. He had lived through war, loss, and decades of loneliness. But in his final years, he had discovered something profound, that a single act of decency offered without expectation of reward could change everything. That courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to do what was right despite it. And that family was not always blood, but sometimes the bonds forged in moments of crisis when humanity mattered most. Amos Thatcher was no longer alone, and he never would be again. If you enjoyed the story, click the video on your screen. Now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier where courage and honor collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to